Good evening. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jim Oliver. I am the provost of the Seminole campus, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Seminole this evening. It's great to see such a terrific turnout, especially the students that I see sitting throughout the audience. If you wouldn't mind, students, would you mind standing so we can kind of give you a round of applause for being involved? Thanks very much for being here. And we want to be sure to recognize our co-sponsors for this event, WUSF Public Media, the Tampa Bay Times, Covanta Energy, Nature's Food Patch, and Clearwater Gas. They've helped present this entire series, so let's give them a round of applause as well. When we launched the Institute for Strategic Policy Solutions in 2010, we had this very kind of event in mind, a forum on a critical topic issue that helps enrich our students' academic experience and, at the same time, reaches out to the community to promote civic engagement. Forums like these are one of the many ways St. Petersburg College expands its mission beyond the classroom, as important as that role is to serve the entire Pinellas community. Again, we thank you for coming this evening and look forward to a stimulating program. Now, to get that program underway, it is my pleasure to bring to the stage the president of St. Petersburg College, Dr. Bill Law, along with our speaker, who will introduce our speaker. Dr. Law.
I know you could get mixed up, two good-looking young guys, okay? That's why I wore the bow tie, so come on over. This is, we have these moments. Jim is right. We created this institute so that we could reach out. As luck would have it, I'm going to personalize a little bit. Today is my 64th birthday, so will you still leave me with? So it is with truly mixed emotions that I get to be both 64, which is, I think somebody called it DOB syndrome is what I have now, okay? Date of birth is my real problem. And to introduce really one of Florida's very, very dynamic, certainly up-and-coming established leaders. You have in your program all of Commissioner Putnam's background and experience, and I want to put a little flavor on just a couple of things. The role that he plays is multifaceted. The Department of Agriculture has any number of responsibilities, all of which impact our daily lives all the time. Most recently, and I know because those of us in education keep close tabs on it, the Department of Agriculture now handles a great deal of our lunch, our school lunch program for our students to be sure that it's well done, that it meets all the nutrition guidelines, that the staff are trained in all of those really important kinds of things. I did some background on the commissioner to people who know him from his experience, and I'll tell one story that really just makes this all work. As you see in his career, he was very successful both in the Florida Legislature and then went to the U.S. Congress, where he moved up very quickly in leadership roles. He, within a few years of arriving, he was the number 5 Republican, and then very quickly after that, the number 3 ranking Republican in the United States Congress. This is the highest rank that any Floridian had achieved in certainly many, many, many years. And then he gave it up to come back to Florida. And I talked to one of his friends. I said, why would somebody do that? I mean, in Congress, longevity is everything. Seniority is the coin of the realm. And he said, I know Adam personally, and it takes too long to get things done in Congress. His passion is to make an impact, and that impact is here in the state. He wants to be part of something that matters in our daily lives, that impacts us and our families and our children and our state, and he wants to get it done as rapidly as we can, the kinds of things that need to be done for all of us. So it is with a great deal. And then I said, tell me more. He said, you know, he's done so many things. He has, you know, his background's in agriculture, but he's currently as knowledgeable and as insightful and as enthusiastic about anyone you could invite in the topic of energy policy, and we are delighted then to have him as part of our institute here tonight. Commissioner Putnam, you do us great honor to be here tonight. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here, particularly those of you who are not compelled for some academic purpose to be here. Just out of curiosity, how many points is this assignment worth? 5 points? Oh, 25 points. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but we're delighted to have you, and delighted to be here on this beautiful campus. You know, Pinellas County has a rich tradition of producing public servants, and I had lunch today with Bill Young, who is an extraordinary leader for the world, and that's really not an overstatement. We all know what he does for Florida and what he does for this country. What's a little bit less well known is his leadership in the world. World leaders who have really grown up in their own country's political institutions, making passes through Washington and always ending up in Bill Young's office. I remember when the president of Italy was elected, and Chairman Young was invited to the inauguration because he'd been, for 20 years, had been stopping by Bill Young's office to ask his opinion on defense policy and foreign affairs. I mean, he is a world treasure, and he's from right here in Pinellas County. When I was a brand new member of the legislature, it was Dennis Jones who, along with his sidekick, the majority leader of the House at that time, Jim King, broke me in and helped me understand the ways of Tallahassee. There's a little room in the back of the House chamber called the Bubble, and I was sent to the Bubble by Jim King and Dennis Jones a time or two. But those two guys have really set the table for energy policy in Florida, and much of what we're focused on in our office is a conversation that really began with the vision of Dennis Jones and Jim King. This is a great opportunity. I appreciate the introduction, and you're absolutely right, Mr. President. It is nice to be home from Washington with my soul and my sanity still intact, and to be in an environment that values problem solving. And Florida state government, regardless of your ideology or your views, is still an institution that values problem solving. We have conflicts between North Florida and South Florida. We have conflicts between the interior and the coast. We have any host of issues in a state as large and diverse as Florida is, but Florida is willing to tackle tough issues and solve those problems. And the flip side of that, which is also missing from Washington, is that we're willing to acknowledge when things did not turn out the way that we assumed that they would, and we're willing to scrap that and start all over again. And you do that in business, you do that in your own personal decision making. If you find that assumptions that you held when you made a decision aren't the case, you scrap it and move on. In Washington, because it takes so long, so many years to pass a particular piece of legislation, when it doesn't turn out the way that you hoped it would, if it ever does finally make it to the finish line, nobody's ever willing to admit that it didn't turn out the way they hoped that it would, because it would be like acknowledging that you had just squandered 6 or 7 or 10 years of your life on a particular policy that you were wrong about. And that's very unfortunate, because they've been wrong about a few things. And in Tallahassee, that's just not the case. It moves quickly, and we tackle problems, and when they don't turn out the way that we hoped that they would, we start over again. And there's really nothing wrong with that. In fact, it is I think, part of the dynamic nature that will keep us competitive relative to the other states. And as Washington's dysfunction continues to perpetuate itself, having strong leaders at the state level will become even more important. Because as global capital makes decisions about where to locate, and they settle on the United States, the competition among the states will grow even greater. And that's why Florida really has to be well positioned to be competitive against those other states and recognize who our competition is, predominantly in the Southeast, the Tennessees, the Carolinas, the Texases of the country, more so than the Northeast or the Rust Belt or the West Coast, and understanding what we have to do to be competitive. So why is the Commissioner of Agriculture here to talk about energy? Isn't that just, being responsible for state fairs and cotton candy and Old McDonald's Farm? And the reason is that Florida is relatively unique in having an elected Commissioner of Agriculture. Florida is singular in having an independently elected cabinet that makes decisions of statewide import on state lands, utilities, banks, insurance companies. But agriculture in Florida, even in the boom times, is the second largest industry. And in difficult times with housing and tourism struggling, agriculture has been that stable base. But it is not some Norman Rockwell tableau. It is a rapidly changing dynamic industry in and of itself. And so, in addition to the 300 different commodities that are grown or raised in the state, the use of that land and the policy impacts of those land use decisions affect everyone, not just from the standpoint of being a $100 billion industry, but frankly, the future of Florida will be largely determined in our undeveloped areas by the future of agriculture. And agriculture, in addition to being cutting edge and developing new varieties of food crops, has diversified into fuels and fuel crops, biomass opportunities. And when you talk about new energy options, typically those will be on agricultural-related lands, whether it is a pellet plant in Cottondale in Florida's Panhandle, which is a town about the size of this campus, or a new plant in Perry, or biofuel plants in South Highlands County, somewhere between Venus and Palmdale, or a world-class solar farm just south of Arcadia. These types of developments in energy impact our rural communities, not to mention the Crystal Rivers and the Levy counties of the world, to bring it a little closer to home. All of these decisions tend to manifest themselves in our rural communities. And so the Department of Agriculture, predating me, had established a beachhead in something called the Farm to Fuel program, recognizing that Midwestern ethanol-based, corn-based ethanol products were not as efficient as the potential new technologies that were out there in second and third generation biofuels. Florida, being well positioned as a state which in Central and South Florida has a year-round growing season, and underutilized land where you weren't converting a food crop into a fuel. You had the potential to either use underutilized or completely unutilized lands that were ancillary to cattle ranching operations, or had been abandoned citrus groves, or any number of reasons why they weren't in active agricultural use. You could put them into an alternative fuel use without having an inflationary pressure on all the other commodities in the grocery store, and you could do it year-round in a state with a year-round growing season. So the department had established this beachhead on that Farm to Fuels program. And then in the 2011 session, there was consideration of moving the state's Office of Energy for the 5th time since it was created in 1975, and sending it back to DEP. It had been in DEP before, it had been in the Department of Community Affairs, it had been in the governor's office, It was in, it was out, it was the redheaded stepchild of state government. And at the same time, we were trying to really sharpen our focus on the narrow bandwidth that ag had in terms of the energy discussion. And the legislature decided that, number one, it didn't make sense to have this bifurcated approach to energy policy. And number two, that DEP, if this is an industry that you want to cultivate and nurture and grow and create jobs and economic development, that's probably not what DEP's strong suit is. They regulate, they permit, they monitor, they assess, they measure, but that's bringing in new economic development and nurturing a possible new industry for the state probably was not for the DEP. And so they moved all of it to the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. So that's how we sort of find ourselves in this position of managing it. I think it's entirely logical. When you look at the connection to rural communities, when you look at the fact that these are fundamentally land use decisions, and in addition to the land use component of how agriculture and ag land use affects everyone, including in our most developed counties, the connection to water cannot be overlooked. And water, in my opinion, even though we're here to talk about energy tonight, those two go hand in hand in many of the technologies. And as Floridians, there is not a more important issue facing us for the long term than water policy. There's not. Whether your objective in life is to save the Everglades, build a subdivision, or plant an orange grove, it will be determined by water policy in the state of Florida. And water wars benefit no one. They are bad for economic development, they are bad for corporate relocation, they are bad for the environment, they are bad for agriculture, they are bad for everyone, and they are to be avoided. But in a legislative type process with 2-year time horizons or 4-year time horizons, you frequently have a situation where water policy does not lend itself well to some type of legislative cure until it is a crisis. And it's really one of the worst issues in the world to wait until it's a crisis to begin to try and solve. So these things go hand in hand, and they are very much connected to agriculture and the work that we do. So we've had this program now for a year and a half. What have we done? The first thing that we did, we inherited what I call, it was messed up like a pile of coat hangers, the Solar Energy Rebate Program. This is a program that had been so wildly popular that it was oversubscribed. It was oversubscribed to the point that people who participated only ended up getting about 52 cents on the dollar of what they had been promised. And even that 52 cents on the dollar had been sitting on someone's desk for 2 years. So we inherited this disaster of a program, had this $25 million program, 12,000 applicants. And in the first 100 days of having that program, we sorted through that, audited it, made sure that the people were entitled to it, funded at 52 cents on the dollar all of those who were eligible, set up a separate mediation process for those who wanted to challenge our decision, and we have substantially resolved that. The other thing that we did immediately in recognizing that we were inheriting a program that had been sort of a quiet policy shop for energy that came and went in popularity depending on the administration, that in a very short period of time had been ramped up to become essentially a grants administrative office. $200 million. $200 million had moved through the state's energy office between 2006 and 2011, between state funds and the federal stimulus program. And so I had inherited all of the decisions about where the money had gone, and I knew that, having been in the legislature and in the Congress, I knew that it was now my baby, and I was going to own it, whether the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I said, well, let's audit this. Let's find out what we can learn from where the $200 million went. We also put together an energy summit that brought together all the stakeholders. And we've now done that twice. Over 500 people participate, academics, entrepreneurs, investors, lenders, a cross-section of people to really exchange these ideas. That to me is particularly important because there is a significant gap that I discovered as I was trying to tackle this learning curve on these issues. When I would go to FIU or USF or UF or the Solar Energy Center or any of our world-class research institutions, they invariably, the professors would tell me these wonderful things about how quickly we would be at rate parity and how fast costs were coming down and how quickly we could deploy this technology and how many jobs we could create in manufacturing using these new technologies. And then I would share that information with a group of energy investors or business leaders or whoever, and they would give me the strangest look, like I was crazy. And I said, well, they said that we were going to be at parity in 3 years. How many of you believe that? And not a single hand would go up. And I said, well, how many in 5? And maybe 1 or 2 hands would go up. And I mean, I kept stretching it out till I said, well, within a decade, and finally the whole room was raising their hand. So there was this big expectations gap between what the research community was seeing and what the people who were actually deploying capital and having to make that happen were seeing. And so we brought those two groups together as part of that energy summit because the energy future, in my opinion, had been oversold and didn't meet expectations. And so the general public, who had been pretty excited about what the possibilities were now shaking their heads saying, how could we have allowed this to happen? We need to cut off all funding because they promised me that we would be living in a world that looked like the Jetsons, and that didn't happen. And so now I don't want to do any of it. So we were really wrecking our future in terms of continuing the pace of research and innovation and development because we had so poorly handled the management of expectations of the general public. So bringing all those ideas and stakeholders together, we put together a modest energy package last year. It was HB 7117. It started off modest. It became even more modest as the process wore on. I say that we began with a very modest bill, and she was stripped of all adornment. But at the end of the day, it was important for several reasons, even separate and apart from the substance of what was in the bill. Pardon the pun, but energy issues had become so radioactive, they'd become so nuclear, that people really didn't even want to talk about it because it had taken on this life of its own because of so many of the battles in the legislature and, frankly, battles that were going on a long way from Tallahassee and the Congress that were bleeding into the conversation in Tallahassee. It became a proxy fight about things that had very little to do with energy or job creation or economic development. And I felt like it was important to reinitiate this conversation at the legislative level on a bipartisan basis to get people comfortable with the notion of talking about energy policy. Because energy policy is foundational for everything else that we do. You can't talk about focusing on job creation if you're not competitive in your energy rates. You can't talk about bringing seniors down here with low cost of living if they don't have low utility bills or stable utility bills. You can't talk about restoring service in a peninsula that dangles out in the middle of Hurricane Alley if you don't have a smart energy policy. So it's foundational to a manufacturing initiative, to a space initiative, to a DOD, military industrial type initiative. It's foundational to so much of the ag processing. It's foundational to pulp and paper. It's foundational to municipal utilities. It is foundational for so many of the other things, and we had a situation where people just didn't even want to bring it up. So it was important to get that buy-in back from our legislative leaders, our policymakers, to say, you can talk about energy at the Rotary Club and talk about it in a very smart way about how it's connected to quality of life, how it's connected to economic development, and how it's connected to job creation. So we put together the bill that restored a number of the tax incentives that had existed in Florida for a very long time. Frankly, some of them had been created before the technologies were even mature enough to avail themselves of those incentives. We made sure that it did not pick winners and losers. It was not a solar bill. It was not a biomass bill. It wasn't a wind bill. It was an energy bill. And we said we want to create a climate in Florida that people who believe they have the next big thing will know that Florida will nurture that. It will be a climate that embraces that. And if they have a product at the end of the process, not at the beginning of the process, which had been so controversial as part of the stimulus process, if you can create a product, sell that product, generate enough of a profit such that you owe the state a corporate income tax, you will get a credit against that because you've proven the technology. The market will determine what that is, and you will benefit from that at the end of the process rather than us determining up front that we want to have more of this and less of this, and we're going to use public policy to manipulate that. That is, in all of these energy debates in any state and at the federal level, the most difficult part of having a long-term consistent energy policy is that we have a political timeline that's measured in 2 years. And so every new legislature, every new governor, every new president has a different set of priorities, and it's impossible for investors to have any kind of clear guidance on where to put their money. If you know that solar's one farm bill away from being out and replaced by corn-based ethanol, or it is one earthquake away from nuclear being completely stripped of all of its loan guarantees, or back in because you get a different administration. Nuclear's in, nuclear's out. Solar's in, solar's out. Biomass is in, biomass is out. It's terribly frustrating to anybody who wants to have some kind of stability or consistency for their shareholders or for their ratepayers. So the bill that we passed with overwhelming legislative support restored the notion that Florida recognizes that we need to have an energy policy. We recognize that it's not our place to pick winners and losers, but it is our place to create a climate to nurture possible new technologies, which is what smart, diverse, knowledge-based economies do. And it is our place to invest in research and development. I mean, that's what got us to the moon. That's what keeps us on the cutting edge in a global economy. And any one of those things is the next big thing that will make all the difference. So that is our place in a knowledge-based global economy where capital moves around the world at the click of a mouse. We also recognize that there are opportunities to support consumers who are confused about conflicting information about what they ought to do with their money to generate efficiencies in their home. So we're creating a clearinghouse where you'll have a one-stop shop on a website where you can say, if I have $250 to put towards my home, what's the most energy efficient thing to do with it? Is it to improve my insulation, or is it to buy a new hot water heater? Is it to put rooftop solar on, or is it to change my, put solar panels on my, and water efficiency devices on my irrigation system? I mean, what is it that for this amount of money I'm going to save, for X amount of input, I'm going to save Y amount in return and spread that over time? There's just so much competing information out there that consumers are confused. So that's part of the bill as well. We're going to inventory biomass in the state. North Florida is a wood basket for the southeastern U.S. And in some places, that wood basket is stranded because of mill closures, sawmill, pulp and paper mill closures. And using this inventory that will utilize satellite technology, we will not only be able to evaluate how much woody biomass is in Florida, we'll be able to age it, we'll be able to track it by disease, we'll be able to track its location relative to existing infrastructure to process that wood basket, so that you'll have a better sense of, is there enough woody biomass to support another GRU plant? if it were located in Dixie County or not? What if it were in Franklin County instead? What if it were in Port St. Joe? What are our opportunities for international export? Right now, that tiny little plant in Cottondale, that's a tiny little town, 100% of it is an export. It's contributing to our balance of trade by shipping a renewable resource to Germany and Netherlands and other European countries for home heating fuel. It's creating port traffic. It's supporting shipping jobs. It's supporting all of the ancillary industries at Port St. Joe. And it's something that has been here since the day that Ponce de Leon set sight on our coastline. So what is old is new again. So the bill accomplished a number of those things, including some very simple things that you would think would be obvious, but this is government, like making it clear that if you install a vehicle charging station in your shopping center or at your corporate complex, your corporate campus, or at your college campus, that you won't have to be regulated as if you were a utility. Apparently, before we changed the law, that's what you would have had to do. So if you want to support the growth and development of electric vehicle recharging stations, this is a way forward to do that. And we've also engaged in a new study of the Florida Energy and Efficiency Conservation Act. It's called FECA, for those of you in the business, to evaluate if we're on the right track. Where are we on efficiency and conservation? We're also working on a survey of state buildings. Which ones are the biggest energy hogs? My guess is that the Office of Energy is in one of the dirty dozen. It's in the Holland building right across from the old Capitol in Tallahassee, named after a great Polk Countyan, but is built, looks like it was built probably in the late 30s, maybe early 40s, and my guess is it's probably not at optimum efficiency. So we come back to the audit. We had evaluated $200 million worth of expenditures. Our Inspector General immediately identified, in a fairly cursory review of the files, 2 bankruptcies that if the checks were on somebody's desk about to be, have a postage stamp attached, and that would have been lost, and $2.5 million in fraud. So $2.5 million of $200 million. You wouldn't say that it's rampant. You wouldn't say that it's pervasive, but it's $2.5 million that hardworking Floridians had paid in taxes, or U.S. taxpayers had paid that had been transferred in the form of ARA. And so we took that off, and the FBI and FDLE are now pursuing that. The remainder of the programs we evaluated for their effectiveness, and that seems like a fairly easy thing to do. But interestingly, they could have been in compliance with their contractual obligations, which in the purest form of the audit would have meant that they had a clean audit, but we would know nothing about what we had actually accomplished. So if the contractual obligations of the audit, of the grant, if the contractual obligations of the grant were that they comply with all state and federal workforce safety rules, and that they pay their bills on time, and that they file their reports on time, they would have technically been in full compliance. That really wasn't why we were doing the audit. We want to know what worked and what didn't work. And going into it, I made it very clear that not something that doesn't accomplish its goals doesn't mean that it was a total failure. I mean, what do we learn from the fact that things didn't turn out the way that we expected them to? I mean, isn't that the nature of research? And so it wasn't just about dinging people because you said that you were going to accomplish this and it didn't work. The knowledge that I want to glean from this is what can we apply to the future that we learned from your project. And so we've actually gone back to all of the grantees and asked for more information and said, look, I know that you've completed your contractual obligations. You need to continue to give us better information about what's going on so that we can shape Florida's energy future. A lot of these things might be incremental savings, or they might yield nothing for the first year, and then suddenly you have a spike because you've had this breakthrough. We wouldn't know that under the strictest terms of the federal guidelines and the state guidelines. So we're creating new guidelines after the fact, and I expect that we're going to have a high rate of compliance. The things that stick out as some of the bigger success stories: the solar energy rebate program, certainly successful if defined by being popular, by being oversubscribed, by the fact that you had a number of people who saw that as an opportunity that they were willing to match with their own funds and have realized savings. In fact, between that and the Energy Star appliance program, they generated $51 million in economic impact and $3.5 million in tax revenue from making those purchases and those installations. I told you what a disaster the solar rebate program was. The energy rebate program was the exact opposite. The difference between the two is that, interestingly enough, American Express managed the energy appliance rebate program. It was a contract. We outsourced it. They know how to find you if you owe them money. They know how to quickly evaluate whether your card's any good. They made their payments in a timely manner, and that program was unbelievably well run, contrasted with the solar rebate program where you were feeding these things back in through Tallahassee, and they sat on a desk for 2 years. So that's an interesting thing moving forward. Interesting lesson learned. I'll give you an example of something that was a failure. They had selected 20 grantees to build out E85 and B20 fueling stations. The idea was that ethanol was going to continue to catch on. Flex fuel vehicles would continue to grow more popular. And as of March 31st, not a single facility had applied for reimbursement. Nothing had been done whatsoever. And 12 of the 20 had already walked away from the deal. By June 30th, they had paid out on 3 and terminated the remaining 5. So what do we learn from? That's a failure. It wasn't fraud, wasn't illegal, wasn't nefarious. It was a program that was designed with a certain outcome in mind, that the market had already moved on. That is not anything to be ashamed of, but it's something to learn from. Because in that brief period of time, the conversation has already shifted to what can be done with CNG, with compressed natural gas. Or the industry, the market, had moved on, and there was no appetite for that particular grant program. The municipal programs that supported energy efficiency block grants in school libraries and county and city buildings have also proven very successful by any standard, almost any standard. So this gives you a sense of how all of these things were allocated. And from a research standpoint, which you have to evaluate that in a very different light than you evaluate the solar rebate program, we're now asking for that feedback from the research community about what have we learned from what you were focusing on? What have we learned from what you studied? It may not be the next big thing, but it may be the intermediate step that leads to that next big thing. And I'm not so sure that we're not giving a more robust audit of research than any other field of research that's out there. And it's not because we're anti-academia. It's not because we're anti the search for new information. It's because we want to know how we can apply those metrics and do a better job talking about what the future, what the promise for Florida's energy future really is. So looking ahead, we have to recognize that these energy issues change rapidly. When I was a member of Congress in 2005, the hottest issue going was that America was bleeding manufacturing jobs in plastics, petrochemicals, pharmaceuticals, you name it, because we couldn't compete with the cost of natural gas. We were hemorrhaging manufacturing any kind of job where natural gas was the feedstock for that processing. Today, we're positioned to be a net exporter of natural gas. In 2005, we were talking about ways to permit LNG facilities to bring it in. Today, the conversation is how to permit facilities to facilitate its export. As a portion of U.S. overall gas production, shale gas went from being 4% in 2005 to 24% today. It's U.S. It is abundant. There's 100 to 150 years of it inside the United States that we know of at current demands. So it's secure, it's reliable, it's affordable, and it's changing the tone of the debate. Now, so what are the policy consequences for Florida on that? For Florida, as a peninsula, we have to produce the electricity that we need to support this economy. We don't have the luxury of buying it from our neighbors. If you were in Iowa, you could say, well, we're not going to build any more plants in our state. We're just going to buy it from our neighbor. We don't have that luxury. Already, we're at 53% of our production is natural gas driven. We are on a path to be roughly 2/3, at least over 60%, dependent on natural gas for our production of electricity, which the positives of that are what I just said. It's domestic, it is abundant, and for the foreseeable future, it's affordable. But if that's our policy decision, then we're going to need more pipes, because right now we've got essentially 2 pipelines bringing it into the state, and they originate in Louisiana Gulf Coast, in Hurricane Alley. So if that becomes our policy decision, we have to adapt and have diversity within that fuel source by having more secure methods of bringing it here, as the other alternative technologies continue to become more affordable and deploy on a broader basis. Become less intermittent, develop the storage capacity for solar, for example, so that it becomes less of an intermittent source. I also think that we have to pursue this conversation about what are alternative uses of that natural gas. It's a cleaner burning fossil fuel than oil, and it's U.S., or at least North American. So how do we convert that to a transportation fuel? Starting with fleets, school buses, postal service, UPS, FedEx, the phone company, the beer trucks, the potato chip trucks, the milk trucks, the people who start at the same place every morning and end up at the same place every night. They have a defined route, they have a defined range. They are the obvious choice for moving goods, services, our kids, our mail around using compressed natural gas instead of Middle Eastern oil. That's a conversation that would not have occurred at the first Farm to Fuel Summit 4 years ago. It would not have been a part of that conversation. So as we look forward, we have to be agile enough to recognize how quickly some of these things are changing. What does the growth of a Chinese and Indian middle class mean for global demand on fossil fuels? What does it mean for demand here in North America? Have we run out of things to plug in our homes in America? So the projections from the Energy Summit are that essentially consumer electricity use will be flat or declining, not because we're going to suffer a reversal in our quality of life, but because we've pretty well maxed out everything that we can possibly be connected to. And that's a whole different, that's for your sociology class, whether that's a good thing or not. Our objective for Florida's energy policy is stability, the idea that there will be predictability in what your bills will be. You will not have wild fluctuations in it. You will have access to a stable supply that is secured from multiple places geographically that reduces our vulnerabilities from man-made or natural disasters. Reliability, the idea that we will be able to rebound from hurricanes, tornadoes, lightning strikes, man-made disasters in a rapid fashion and avoid blackouts and brownouts that have plagued other parts of our country. And diversity, the source of this whole conversation, that we have to have an all-of-the-above strategy to solve these problems. There are people who think that if we just went to all renewable, everything would be fine. It's not ready for prime time. It's not ready for broad adaptation. It's still intermittent. We don't have the storage capacity. The numbers don't work if we were going to wave our pixie dust and immediately move to a complete renewable economy. But we're making progress through research and development and bringing those costs down and having markets determine which of those make the most sense for the state of Florida versus the state of Georgia, the Southeast versus the Northeast. It has to be all of the above. Natural gas has transformed this debate in ways we couldn't have imagined, not just about electricity now, but now we're talking about transportation fuels. That has to be a part of the solution. Anything that reduces our dependence as a nation on countries that are hostile to our interests has to be a part of that equation. I want our kids to be able to look at a map of the world and point to the Middle East and say, what a fascinating part of the world I'd love to visit, but know that it is irrelevant to our country's economic security or future. That ought to be our objective. And through that all-of-the-above approach and fuel diversity, we can get there. The energy market requires long-term, predictable policy in the state of Florida if we're going to continue to attract manufacturing, corporate relocations, retirees, and young entrepreneurs. We can't pick winners and losers, but we must support innovation and create the climate that nurtures the next big thing. We have to enhance Florida's infrastructure capacity to move these products around and to diversify our sources, even within fuel categories. And we have to continue to do this on a bipartisan basis. As I said in the beginning, energy policy is foundational to so many of the other things that are important to the future of our state. And I wouldn't trade places with any other state. I'd rather be Florida with Florida's problems than any other state. I'd rather be us than Ohio. I'd rather be us than Michigan. I'd rather be us than New York. I'd rather be us than California, Lord knows. But to come out of this recession stronger and more diversified as an economy, energy policy has to be on the discussion. It has to be on the table for discussion. And solving these problems will help us to solve the other problems that will make us the most competitive, desirable state in the Union to live, work, play, raise a family, and find your piece of the American dream. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you.
Thank you very much. Sitting? Sure, where there's a microphone. Great. Thank you so much. I'm Susan Glickman. I direct the Florida Business Network for a Clean Energy Economy, and I have had the privilege of moderating the sixth session that we've held. We held 3 sessions in 2010 that were sort of an outgrowth of the oil spill, which were sort of a little different animal than the conversation that we're having tonight, of course, which focuses on what's moving forward. That was really a community in crisis, and the Institute for Strategic Policy Solutions, and it was just being formed at that time, was really an integral part of the community, I think, providing an outlet for people to get information, and very proud to be affiliated and associated with St. Petersburg College, which Congressman Young helped to start, and of course Senator Jones, and really becoming a very important piece of the community. And so this series, this is the third and wraps up this series. We started out looking at nuclear and the early cost recovery, which has become quite controversial, as you know, in our community in particular. And then we looked at renewables and energy efficiency as the solution side of the puzzle. And now we're here tonight, and this is perfect, and I so appreciate your being here. I know it's been a very busy week. There was a huge energy summit, which I attended. That was pretty terrific. I have been at all the farm to fuel summits and all the energy summits, so I have that history. And there were deals being made there. I don't know if that that helps you. So it's quite a pleasure to have leadership from Commissioner Putnam, who actually understands energy issues, which is not uncomplicated. He also understands the politicization of energy issues. And I think one of the things I'm most impressed with, you understand the energy water nexus, and that connection takes energy to make water and water to make energy. And so it's pretty important. So I want to start out, because we have a few people that have contacted me about asking some specific questions. So I just wanted to start out with something, which you talked about, I'd rather be in Florida. And the question that I've got as someone who's been working on this host of issues for more than a decade is people always talk to me about what other states are doing. And we know that 31 states have targets for renewable energy and almost as many targets for energy efficiency. And we don't have that. So what do you see as the barrier, the biggest barriers to Florida? And as part of that, the fact that we send about $50 billion out of state every year, about $17 billion on the electric side and another $30 billion or so on transportation. So what do you see? And then the only thing I wanted to add is, even though solar is continuing to go down, we're now down at $2 a watt. So that's changed in a very short period of time. Very, very short period of time. So anyway, what do you see as the biggest barriers to Florida?
Well, I think that the idea of a mandate was a non-starter in the legislature. The sense was really in large part because of this rapid development, new discoveries on one side, technological breakthroughs that were bringing down the costs of renewables. The sense was that Florida, because we're a peninsula, because so many things were rapidly changing, that it would not make sense to set a mandate of a percentage for Florida utilities to have to hit. I think that it's important that we have, and the bill actually, when it was introduced, had a number of things that encouraged further development in renewables, but without that hard and fast mandate. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. I think that we should direct the PSC, and the legislature should make clear through energy policy that we want to nurture all of the technologies that are available to us. And if natural gas is a marginal improvement over coal or oil-fired plants, then that's a desirable thing, and it is more reliable, and in this difficult economy, far more affordable than where we are on many of the intermittent alternative sources as of today. So I believe that the absence of a mandate keeps us agile, keeps us able to adapt to new technologies in a rapid way, but it doesn't mean, it shouldn't be taken as an excuse not to be willing to have an all-of-the-above approach. And I think that's a key difference. I wouldn't interpret it as a reason not to continue to push forward on all of the technologies that are out there that make sense for a state like Florida.
Right. So we wanted you to feel welcome in Pinellas County, so this is where I live. And so we brought somebody over from Polk who knows you. Wogie Badcock, who's here from Badcock Furniture and represents the Florida Retail Federation, had a question to ask you. Oh, you want to, yeah, get the microphone. I'm sorry, David. I don't know if Wogie needs a microphone. No.
Good afternoon, Commissioner. Good to see you. Today, I learned something today. I was at the PSC nominating committee today, and I understand from the Retail Federation that 15 years ago, you were our our state representative when we built our new warehouse on Highway 60 between where you live in Bartow and us in Mulberry. And we wanted to put solar on top of the 3,000 square foot facility. That would be great. But our return on investment from the bean counters said it's a 15-year, 17-year return on investment. So that was study was done about 10 years ago. technology is probably a whole lot better today. You're talking about the storage of solar. But so if it's so much better today and we produce much more solar energy than I need to use for my distribution center, why can I not sell that energy off to the grid? And I'm told there's a lawsuit. There was a lawsuit, they refer to PW Ventures, and it says it has something to do with the current providers of our energy. And anybody that's driven from St. Petersburg to Orlando on I-4 sees all those distribution centers. I think that was just, we should really look into that. And it doesn't seem like the policymakers are not ready to address that issue with this PW venture. So I just didn't know about that.
You're absolutely right. The climate for solar, since you looked into it, has gotten significantly better. And we've seen Darden Restaurants has put a solar facility on top of their headquarters in Orlando, which is I believe they tell me it's a 7-year. It's either 6 or 7-year return on investment. JM Family, the Toyota distributors in Southeast Florida, have put a significant solar facility on one of their dealerships. So we are seeing more and more avail themselves of that. As under current law, you can install it. Badcock could install it on their facilities, and they could sell it back. They could not use a third party to do that, and that's the PW Ventures issue. That's an unresolved issue. I would say that is an issue that we talked an awful lot about when we were putting the bill together a year ago, and decided that because it had been run through the legislature before unsuccessfully, we didn't want it to be something that would bring down an energy bill and give us 5 straight years instead of 4 straight years of no energy bill. That is an issue that's one of several issues. This is the reason why I asked the Council of 100 to put together an energy task force, because that's an issue that the Council of 100 has never been shy about making recommendations on how higher education ought to be shaken up, or how water policy ought to be shaken up, or how early childhood education ought to be shaken up. And to me, energy is a perfect issue to be tackled at the sea level of Florida's businesses, because until there's some kind of a consensus about how we move forward on that issue is going to continue to bog down in the legislature, and it's not going to move. And I think that there are ways for us to be smarter about how we produce energy. There's some academics, I mean, this is one of the things I've learned as I've traveled around the state. There's some academics who say that non-utility scale solar is not the most efficient use of investments. That solar really only works when you can get that economy of scale. I don't know if that's. I mean, I don't know that I buy that. But that that's what smart people who do nothing but study solar would say. If you look at the popularity of solar, if you look at the popularity of the solar rebate, to me, the intangible value of that, even if it's not the most efficient kilowatt per penny or whatever that metric is, what it does do that I think is an intangible benefit to all Floridians is that it gets people in the habit of paying attention to what they're paying. And they can adjust their consumption, because now they're a fully engaged and aware customer. Just like the person riding down the street making a decision about which gas station to pull into based on a penny's difference. And that is worth an awful lot if we're going to change people's mindset about energy consumption in the state.
So I'm going to say something, but Carl Nurse who's from the City Council of St. Pete, is going to ask the next question. So I think one of the things that I get from that's very interesting, you talk about prices, and you're kind of stuck in your mind on something you heard about 10 years ago. One of the things that is wholly unique in this energy dynamic is that the costs have changed literally just in the last few years. So when you talk about, people talk about renewables cost more, and I typically say cost more as opposed to what? Because it really doesn't cost anymore, particularly when you look about solar PV on your rooftop. It's now cost competitive with a new nuclear power plant, albeit it's not 24/7. But if you take a solar panel versus peaking power, so that's more expensive. So, but traditionally, it's just been a knee-jerk reaction. People talk about solar costing more than renewables, and I think that's part of the old dynamic, and I just want to make that point. And Wogi, you were talking about a price you got 10 years ago. It's now down to $2 a watt. That's a whole different dynamic. Yeah.
Floridians feel really good about solar because it's green, and I'm not putting fossil fuels in the air, so.
Well,
That's
absolutely.
another-
But now that it's cost competitive, it's a different animal. We couldn't have had that conversation.
I don't care how green it is. It's got to be cost competitive if you're going to have widespread adoption in the marketplace, and we're getting there. But I can't move anything through the legislature at a time when we've got 8.5% unemployment. We can't create a New Jersey-style subsidy structure if it's not cost competitive, and it's infinitely more cost competitive today than it was a decade ago. So my point when we first took this on, and Susan and I were talking about this, think of all the energy that's been spent in the no pun intended, think of all the political capital that has been spent in the energy debate about this concept of recovery rates and PW Ventures and these other things, that if we really are at rate parity, that whole issue goes away, and we can now really truly talk about an all-of-the-above approach. And we don't have to revisit the battles because the technology has now reached a point where it's ahead of the political debate. And that's actually very common in politics when you're talking about technology.
So Carl Nurse is on the City Council in St. Petersburg.
Good evening, and thank you for being an adult in trying to get past the silliness in energy stuff. I would like to talk about energy efficiency for a moment, and the subject is LED streetlights. Florida basically doesn't have LED streetlights because the tariff that is set up at the State Public Service Commission makes it impractical. But let me compare that to it's one of the reasons why I'm glad that Duke purchased Progress Energy, is that in Raleigh-Durham, in Duke's territory, their Public Service Commission allows the use of modern LED streetlights. And what that means to a city like St. Petersburg, where we have 30,000 streetlights, where we pay $5 million a year to the power company, if we could convert to LEDs, it would save us a couple $1 million a year. The payback for the capital is about 4.7 years. And I should mention, by the way, that the state DOT has a considerable, it would be a multiple of that power bill to light the state roads and interstates around the state. But what it would require is a change of what they call the streetlight conversion tariff. And this
PSC has a rule against converting streetlights to LED. This is as good as the electric vehicle recharging station.
Well, what you were talking about being nimble. The only tariffs that are there are for technology that is obsolete, which is priced high enough so that nobody can do it. But if we could use the same technology that Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina is using, Cree happens to be the manufacturer, one of the largest LED manufacturers in the country. Conservatively, it's a 40% reduction in cost, and it's not just the street lights. Think about half of the cost of a street light is the maintenance, because it's an event to change a street light. It's not just a guy on the truck. It's the two guys to make sure he doesn't get killed while he's doing it. And so across the state, it's a couple $100 million a year. And I mention that because tomorrow I'm going to the Florida League of Cities, where I'll be the head of the Energy Committee, and I think it's going to be one of our priorities, because every city, as well as the state, could save money at that. And frankly, it's not going to happen unless we can get some help from you.
That's a great issue. Thank you. That one's new to me.
Stephen Smith with Southern Alliance for Clean Energy.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. Appreciate you being here. Appreciate your leadership on these issues. I have one quick comment and then a question. What you just said. Stephen Smith with Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. You mentioned the not to pick winners and losers. The problem with that is that there's a policy in the state right now where nuclear cost recovery gets captured early. All of us who have gray hair are paying significant money to the utilities for nuclear reactors that will likely never be built. There's no other technology that's getting that early cost recovery. And so if you're truly going to have a level playing field, and you really do believe in not picking winners and losers, why are we paying this money to the utilities for nuclear reactors that will never get built? That's my comment. The question I have is that one of the real issues that we see in Florida is the dysfunction at the Public Service Commission, and we identified that one of the real issues is there that when we look at other utilities in the Southeast, they all have to do what's called integrated resource planning, where they put the supply side options, gas, nuclear, coal, renewables, against demand side options, and they force every one of those things to be dealt with on a level playing field. Florida does not have an integrated resource planning requirement. They have a 10-year site plan, they have FECA, they have need determination. And what ends up happening is that the utilities come into the Public Service Commission and they manipulate the 10-year site plan and the need determination to get their capacity agreed to by the commission. Then they come in and do their FECA analysis, which basically says because we have this capacity coming, we don't really need to do energy efficiency, and they completely game the system. And because they're not dealing with, in Georgia, Southern Company has to deal, Georgia Power has to deal with a 3-year integrated resource plan. Duke and Progress in the Carolinas has a 1-year integrated resource plan. The Tennessee Valley Authority in Tennessee has a 5-year integrated resource plan. All the other states in the Southeast put everything on a level playing field. But because our Public Service Commission has been manipulated by the utilities, and because the legislature and the governor's missing in action here do not engage in this, basically what happens is we're trending to this high dependency on gas. With an IRP, you look at not only cost, but you also look at risk. And they're equally evaluated because some things may appear to be a low cost option, but they may be high risk. And so this is what an integrated resource planning. So your office, we've talked to Patrick and others, could propose having integrated resource planning as part of a legislative package, just like every other state in the United States has this thing. And it would have us to be able to deal with renewables, energy efficiency, and supply side options, all on a level playing field, looking at not only cost and risk. So I implore you to think about that, and just wanted to know if you'd ever heard of it. Has that ever been brought to your attention? But this is part of what we've done through our analysis, seen as the dysfunction in Florida that is trending towards these crazy things where we're paying utilities a nuclear tax for something they will likely never build. We've got the Humpty Dumpty reactor up here at Crystal River. We've got all these other things going on, and yet there isn't a functional Public Service Commission analysis that forces the utility to do that kind of planning. So I ask you what your opinion is on long-range planning, integrated resource planning, and I think it's something I'd ask you to put in your legislative package to contemplate, and I think it would help us here in Florida greatly. Thank you.
So if all the other states have it, and when you look at the other southeastern states, they're overwhelmingly dependent on coal. So how did that reduce their dependency on a dominant fuel source?
Well, again, when the coal plants were built in the 50s and 60s, and because the environmental cost and the impacts of coal largely were not being factored in, it was both a low cost and a low risk option. What's happening now, though, is if you look at what's happening, Duke and Progress have had significant coal plant retirements. TVA's announced over 2,000 megawatts of coal plant retirements. Their IRP recommended 4,000 megawatts. Southern Company's looking at 8,000 megawatts of coal retirements. They're shifting the gas. They're also looking
or nuclear.
Well, let's think about who's doing nuclear. Only Southern Company is doing nuclear in the ones that I mentioned. VC Summer in South Carolina. All the other nuclear plants have come off the table because demand is down, because of Fukushima, because of gas prices, and because Wall Street won't touch those things. And the problem is, if we didn't have early cost recovery here in Florida, you talk about letting the market decide, the market wouldn't touch nuclear power without socializing the risk and privatizing the profits. If you're an executive at a utility company, you move a $14 or $20 billion asset in your rate base, you're golden. But for those of us who pay the bill, and that plant never gets built, it's a travesty. I mean, we've now, because of failure in the administration, failure in the legislature, we've appealed this to the Florida Supreme Court because it is absolutely ridiculous that Florida citizens are paying for plants that will never get built.
Let me ask you something. What would be an ideal portfolio in your mind?
Well, I don't want to prejudge that because I think if you do integrated resource planning and you let the numbers decide objectively, you will create a graph, and it looks like a curve, and it'll show you cost and risk, and you will then be able to determine whether a scenario like going with nuclear power, the utilities say that's low cost, but it's actually high risk in the long run because of the cost overruns, because of Fukushima, because of the other issues.
So if you take nuclear off the table.
Well, I don't think you want to take anything off the table.
Well, no, but I mean, realistically, that's what you said. You get, I mean, because of Wall Street, because of Fukushima, because of this.
I'm saying let nuclear compete without choosing winners and losers. Take away the early cost recovery, give it a level playing field. You're not giving early cost recovery to solar. You're not giving it to biomass. You're not giving it to gas, but you're giving it to nuclear. But then at the same time, you're saying you don't want to pick winners and losers. But you're actually picking winners and losers by supporting that policy.
I understand that.
Okay,
And
so
I
let the
also
process.
wasn't there when they passed it, but that's not my point, because I do think nuclear is an important part of the portfolio. My point is that, as I said in my speech, everything about energy is severely manipulated. And so, because of regulatory risk, there's no coal, not even clean coal. Nobody's willing to take that risk. Regulatory, they're not putting it on their shareholders. So coal's off the table. Hang on. So coal's off the table.
Right.
For any number of reasons, including upfront costs of nuclear, it's off the table. So nuclear and coal are essentially off the table. So for 24/7 base power, the only thing left is natural gas. Well, and so that's because we don't want more oil plants. So you take oil, coal, and nuclear off the table, you have an extraordinary dependency on natural gas. Now we're lucky that it's domestic as of the last several years.
Right.
It's affordable at current demand levels, but obviously demand's not going to remain current if we're talking about converting it to transportation uses, and all the new electricity plants are going to be natural gas. So that's not a realistic assumption longer than about a decade or 15 years out. So all of these, everybody wants to have this idealistic vision for what energy will be, but the simple fact is, do I believe that renewables ought to be a part of that? Absolutely, they ought to be a part of it. But if you quintupled it, it would be what, 7%?
But you're missing my point. My point is, let's don't prejudge that. Let's let a thorough, systematic approach called integrated resource planning model it, put the cost, the benefits, the risk, all that on the table, and let's let that figure it out. Because what happened is, we have politicized the process so much. You identified that correctly yourself. We've tried to run stuff through the legislature. FP&L's tried to run stuff. Progress has tried to run. Everybody's playing the political game. But let's let the numbers decide. So I have a sense of what that would look like based on integrated resource plannings in other states. But Florida's unique. It's a peninsula state. It's constrained in several different ways. But
And we
until
don't have the luxury of having a state, it's not in a
you have a
vacuum.
public
It's not in a
service
vacuum,
commission.
because I'm reacting to what DC is too.
No,
You can say, well,
but you have
Florida
a
ought to be
public,
this.
you have a public service commission that is supposed to look out for our interests and not be a captive agency to the utilities.
I get that.
And
but
so if they did their job,
You two boys up, come on.
yeah, so I'm just saying, think about integrated resource planning. If it works everywhere else, why wouldn't it work here? And if you're concerned about where we're going, let's let the numbers decide and take the politics out of it. Thank you.
Andy Bell? Where's Andy Bell? Right there you are. Yeah. David, back in the back, please. It's like when you're on stage, you can't see anybody.
Commissioner, thank you for being here. I'm Reverend Andy Bell. I'm the Executive Director of Sunshine State Interfaith Power and Light. We're a statewide interfaith organization with a focus on caring for God's earth. I come here tonight from a somewhat different perspective than many of the issues you've talked about and that many people bring up, even though they're all related. Because I come as a person of faith and representing all faith communities when it comes to caring for the earth, one of the wonderful things that we all hold in common when you look at all of the major world religions is this: a two-pronged belief about the earth. Number one, it does not belong to us. It never has, it never will. And number two, that we are intended and called to be very benevolent stewards. On the second part, granted, we haven't done so well. I was hearing earlier about making sure that all of the costs are accounted for, that there's an appropriate return on investment by the bean counters. But what I haven't heard talked about is the larger issues of energy production that are completely and totally externalized, but people pay the price for. We're talking about energy. I haven't heard anybody talk about global climate change. I haven't heard anybody talk about the carbon emissions as we have used our atmosphere and our oceans as a carbon sink, basically a gigantic sewer. Yes, there is no doubt that natural gas is a cleaner carbon-based fuel than petroleum or coal. But still, nobody's talking about the externalized cost of continuing to pour these gigatons upon gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere, the long-term impacts, as well as the current cost that we're all paying, especially our children. The Department of Defense, the CIA, the NSA are already predicting that we're going to be looking at 50 million climate refugees in this country by the middle of this century. Florida is going to receive one of the most direct impacts. From a faith perspective, in representing many, many faith communities, I'm asking you if people of faith can enter into this dialogue and bring much larger perspectives than just free enterprise, capitalistic system, and who's going to get the biggest buck for the dollar.
We're a proud capitalistic society. I'm not at all saying that, I mean, my faith guides me just as yours guides you to be a good steward of the land. You could pull 20 people off the sidewalk and you'd have 19 different opinions of what their version of stewardship would be and at what price they were willing to become greater and greater stewards. And as you correctly pointed out, externalities are very difficult to measure. At what point are you willing to place standards on the U.S. that would not apply to an India or China who aspire to a middle class and I would think have every right to accomplish that. Can I respond to that question? Sure.
It's a legitimate question that we hear in the news all the time, but it's not a far stretch to take it back to what most of us were taught in kindergarten. When your mom says, if your friend jumps off the bridge, are you going to follow them? No. So when we talk about what other nations are doing, we are called to be leaders. We are called to be people who take a higher and better approach and then show others how to do likewise.
Look, I share your passion for being a good steward of the earth, but I am not in a position or prepared to when we're making these decisions about how we power our economy, natural gas is unquestionably better than what we have. Nuclear is zero emission of carbon. So does that make you a nuclear advocate? Or, is that what you're suggesting, that we have more nuclear because it's zero emission, zero carbon?
No.
So what's left? What do you suggest that we have that would be the highest and best stewardship rating for our planet?
Again, I'm not an energy expert, but I can offer a suggestion. Just as a few minutes ago we were talking about the E85 and the B20 facilities that never opened because things changed so quickly, if we were able to focus on emerging renewable, sustainable technologies, put a much higher emphasis on those, put much more of an investment into those, and accept that for a very short amount of time, natural gas may have to be, as T. Boone called it, a transition fuel. Let it be, as we are putting all of our energy and all of our effort into transitioning to sustainable, renewable energy that no longer hurts people or any of creation.
We wanted to get a couple more in before we go. Are you finished? I know Ann Lopez and Chuck Warrington from Clearwater Gas wanted to ask a question. Did you want to respond to that? I just didn't. Okay. We're good.
I think I've done all I can do.
Yeah. Well, it's not uncomplicated, for sure.
Chuck Warrington, Clearwater Gas. Appreciate the comments you made on the natural gas use in transportation. We're real proud the Clearwater Gas System in the city of Clearwater built the first public fill station of any size in the state, and actually still has the largest public fill station in the southeast United States here, and we are converting a number of vehicles as we speak. So that's, I think, a really good thing for our state, and there's a lot more of it going on. What I wanted to get on the table is a diversity issue, and that is the use of natural gas for end uses. The fact is that if 350,000 water heaters were converted to natural gas, you could avoid building a 300 megawatt electric power plant, and you could eliminate 510,000 tons of carbon that we've just talked about from entering the atmosphere every year. And we would also, by eliminating the power plant, use a lot less water because power plants use water. So we keep talking about electricity and use of natural gas to make electricity, which certainly is a good resource we have today. But I would maintain that there's the expansion of the natural gas system in the state to be able to use it as end use in homes and businesses and industries it would be a major boon to Florida.
Lopez going to ask a question. I just want to make one comment about this issue of becoming more efficient, because people talk about more natural gas. It's like the electrification of transportation. If you electrify a car from a gas-driven engine and it's 300 times more efficient, you know, that's fine if it uses electricity because it's a lot more efficient in the system. And I think that's what you're talking about when you go to gas with cars or fleets or for end use. So I think it's important to understand the role that gas plays there. Ann, I know you had one question. You're at the beach, even though you might not know it yet. So this is someone who comes from Beach Royalty, and she has a beach question.
Hi, yes, I'm Beach Royalty. I don't know what that is.
What is that?
Surfing Beach Royalty.
I hope it's not like Prince Harry.
Are you a surfer? I own a vacation rental business as well as a surf shop over in Indian Rocks Beach on the Barrier Island. And 2 years ago, when the Gulf spill, the BP oil spill, was not so grand for our business, both the surf shop and our vacation rentals, despite the fact that we have yet to see oil here, thank you God, did suffer economically. So, and our hearts were broken. So I was just wondering what your opinions or stance or views on drilling in the Gulf are. Yeah.
We, our office actually has a significant role in that, in the aftermath of the BP oil spill, because we are responsible for food safety and testing, and we collect samples of seafood, shellfish, finfish, a whole host of things, and have since the spill. And fortunately, thank goodness, have not detected any problems in the health and safety of that. And obviously trying to rebuild our communities, the working waterfronts, the oystermen, the fishermen, commercial and recreational, our tourism communities. I mean, Florida certainly has an enormous connection to the water. In fact, in a state that really doesn't have much of a common identity, if we do, I mean, to the extent that we do, it's really that connection to the water. So I don't think that any kind of drilling in the Gulf, certainly not near shore, has any future in our discussion. I think that, frankly, I don't want to sound like Johnny One Note here, but the discovery of natural gas has fundamentally altered the pressures on a state like Florida, and in a positive way, reduced that. And I think that you've even, I think that even on a broad basis, the legislature has ended that conversation. So, from that perspective, I don't see it being revisited anytime soon. It's important.
So that's the last question, because it's 8 o'clock and we promised to get out of here on time. Well, in the interest of time, we tried to pull together sort of a representative sample of people. So
I'll be
I think he'll
I'll
be
be
here
around.
afterwards if you want to come ask questions.
I'm not rushing out the door.
Sounds great. David Clement, thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Commissioner. May we have a round of applause for our moderator? I'm sure that we could keep going longer, but we do try to honor your time. So you can watch this in a couple of days. It'll be on our website. You can see reruns of the previous sessions on our website as well. And I want to invite you to come to our next two events. The first one is on September 12th. It's related to the anniversary of 9/11. And the second program is on October 4th, and it deals with the constitutional amendments that you will be asked to vote on. And that is a free forum just like this one. We invite you to turn out for all of them. And now thank you all for coming, and good night, safe trip home.